He awoke to the clink of cold steel, wrists bound in front of a hushed courtroom that once rang with his measured gavel. The judge's ebony robe, his shield of authority, felt like a funeral shroud as he was led past gasping spectators, each step a fresh wound to his pride. In that moment, the very walls he swore to honor seemed to mock him, their marble pillars bearing silent witness to his disgrace. Rumors curled through the gallery like poisonous smoke, whispering of forged records and betrayal so intimate it tasted of blood. Even the air felt heavy, tainted by the echo of cuffed hands and crushed dreams. Behind every pair of judging eyes, a question hung unanswered. How far could power be twisted before a righteous man was broken? What happened next shocked everyone and set off a chain of events no one saw coming. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we start the story, comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from today. And if you find this story impactful, don't forget to subscribe for more. A sliver of silver light crept through the narrow gap in the curtains, brushing across the polished wood of a small desk where a single envelope lay unopened. Inside, Matthew Sullivan had scribbled his name in tidy blue ink, bolstering the envelope against the table's edge with a practiced tremor in his fingers. He had awoken an hour before dawn, haunted by fragments of a dream he could not quite recall, a face half hidden in shadow, a voice warning him of justice undone. Even now, the echo pressed against his temples like the heavy hush before a storm. He rose quietly from a narrow bed in his modest apartment, each movement measured as though he were tiptoeing through an invisible courtroom. The room smelled faintly of old leather, books he had never found time to read, and the distant promise of rain. Matthew paused by the window, drawing back the curtain to peer at the empty street below. The city slept beneath a lavender sky, its brightness edged only by the distant hum of traffic on the main avenue. Street lamps glowed like watchful sentinels, their pools of golden light illuminating pavement slick with last night's mist. He let the envelope fall into his coat pocket and stepped into the hallway, the worn carpeting muffling his footsteps. In the communal stairwell, faded photographs of town fairs and charity drives lined the walls, snapshots of a community proud of its civic spirit. Matthew, a judge appointed just 2 years ago, often thought of those images when he felt the weight of his position. He told himself that justice, like charity, began at home. Yet sometimes home felt small, confined to cracked sidewalks and closed doors. The courthouse loomed 2 blocks away, a stately brick building crowned by a weathered clock tower. As he walked, his leather shoes tapping a steady rhythm, the scent of damp earth and brewing coffee drifted toward him. He passed a row of shuttered shops, a bakery known for its morning buns, a florist arranging lilies behind frosted glass, and a bookstore whose owner still left the door ajar at odd hours. Matthew slowed at each storefront, offering a gentle nod or a brief word of greeting. He was known for kindness, for remembering details. A daughter named Sophie turning 8 next month, a veteran with a limp who boarded the bus near 4th and Pine. These small acts grounded him, reminded him that behind every case file was a life. Inside the courthouse, the marble floor felt cool beneath his feet. The grand foyer, with its high ceilings and ornate chandeliers, was empty save for a lone security guard at his desk. Matthew offered a polite smile when their eyes met. He crossed to the cloakroom, shrugged into his dark robe, and fastened the silver collar that marked him as the town's youngest judge. The weight of the fabric settled on his shoulders like a promise he could not yet fully keep. His chambers lay at the end of a carpeted corridor. The door stood ajar, light spilling into the hallway. Inside, walls lined with law books rose floor to ceiling, their spines a rainbow of faded leather. Family photographs clustered on the mantel. His wife's gentle smile in a bridal portrait, Sophie building sandcastles on a sunlit beach, a younger Matthew shaking hands with a mentor who had once tutored him in mock trials. On the desk, the unopened envelope waited, little more than a bulky bookmark in his morning ritual. Matthew sank into the high-backed chair, fingertips resting on the cool wood. He glanced at the calendar pinned to the corkboard. 3 days until the hearing that would test everything he believed about fairness. A wealthy corporation challenged by a single mother fighting to save her home. Public interest swirled around the case like a gathering storm. The newspapers had already picked sides. Matthew had promised himself he would remain impartial, but he admitted in quiet moments that his heart raced at the thought of the final gavel descending. He took in a steadying breath, then withdrew the envelope. It bore no return address, only his name in handwriting that danced slightly across the paper. With careful precision, he slit the flap, unfolding a single sheet of crisp stationery. The message inside was brief, each word etched with an unspoken weight. Some truths are buried to protect the powerful. Your silence will see them remain so. He read it twice, the second time aloud in a trembling whisper. A callous shiver traced his spine. Who had sent it and why? The warning seemed aimed at him, not the corporation, not the mother. Matthew clenched the paper in his hand, knuckles whitening. He laid it flat on the desk, the black ink staring back like an accusation. Outside the window, the first raindrops began to tap against the glass, as if to punctuate his unease. He pressed his palm to the cool pane, watching the streaks run down in silver threads. In the stillness, he could almost hear the distant wail of sirens winding through the city. It was a reminder that beyond his chambers, the machinery of law and order roared relentlessly onward. Unbidden, memories surfaced of his earliest days on the bench, the hope that had filled his chest, the belief that he could bend the truth toward justice with a single ruling. He had grown up believing in clear answers, right and wrong, black and white. But now the lines seemed to blur. Every case held shadows, every witness a secret, and the deeper he looked, the more the world refused to yield its certainties. A soft rap at the door drew him back. He folded the letter and slid it into a drawer alongside other unopened correspondence. "Come in," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. Detective Daniel Cross entered, tall and broad-shouldered, with angular features hardened by years on the force. He paused by the door. His uniform was immaculate, the badge on his chest catching the light like a promise of accountability. Yet his expression was unreadable, brows drawn tight. "Morning, Judge Sullivan," Cross said, his voice low. "Sorry to bother you so early." Matthew gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "Not at all, Detective. What brings you here?" Cross closed the door behind him and settled into the seat, producing a manila folder. He slid it across the desk. "We need to discuss security for the hearing next week. There's been chatter, protests, pickets, some threats too." Matthew sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I received a note this morning myself." He tapped the drawer. A warning of buried truths. Cross leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "You think it's connected?" Matthew met his gaze. "I'm not sure what to think. But if someone's trying to intimidate the court," his voice trailed off as thunder rumbled overhead. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the roof like impatient fingers. Cross nodded. "We'll step up patrols. I want undercover units in the gallery, plainclothes officers in the corridors. No surprises." Matthew appreciated the detective's thoroughness even as his chest tightened. He was a simple man by nature, accustomed to fair arguments and open evidence. The thought of hidden forces at work unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Yet this was his world now, the world of whispered threats and veiled intentions. As Cross outlined the details, Matthew's mind drifted back to the letter. Who would benefit if the case were derailed? The wealthy investors with deep pockets? The judge himself, kept in the dark and powerless? He swallowed hard, the taste of damp fear on his tongue. When Cross departed, Matthew remained seated, staring at the empty doorway. The courthouse whole seemed to groan with expectation, as though they too were bracing for what was to come. In that moment, Matthew Sullivan felt the gravity of his role more acutely than ever before. He was not just a man in a black robe. He was the linchpin in a struggle that extended far beyond his chambers into the shadows where truth and power collided. Gathering his resolve, he rose and walked to the window. The rain had turned the world outside into a shifting mosaic of gray and silver. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled, each chime a reminder of time's relentlessness. Matthew pressed his forehead against the cool glass, drawing strength from the silence within. He allowed himself one final breath before turning away. The envelope lay on the desk, its message a silent herald of conflict. And as he reached for his robe to begin the day's work, he steeled himself for the trial that would test not only his judgment, but his very belief in justice. The stage was set, the players in motion, and the first act of this unfolding drama had only just begun. The morning sky was bruised purple and gray when Matthew Sullivan stepped out of his apartment, the air heavy with the promise of rain. The clouds hung low, pressing against the rooftops like a silent jury waiting to deliver a verdict. Matthew's heart thrummed against his ribs as he buttoned his robe, each toggling a fragile attempt to hold himself together. He had faced down defendants and prosecutors, but nothing in his 2 years on the bench had prepared him for what lay ahead. As he approached the courthouse, the worn stone steps slick with drizzle, he noticed an unusual stir of activity. Uniformed officers milled about the entrance, their breath misting in the cool air. A small crowd had gathered behind yellow tape, umbrellas bobbing like colorful moths against the monolithic facade. Matthew's throat tightened with unease. He had expected protests, supporters of the mother fighting the corporation, but not this level of security. He passed through the metal detectors, his robe brushed the scanner and beeped softly, offering a polite nod to the guard who scrutinized him with a hint of curiosity. Inside, the foyer felt cavernous, the chandeliers dimmed as though the building itself awaited news. He walked the corridor that led to courtroom 3, footsteps echoing against marble walls lined with old portraits, former judges in powdered wigs, their stern faces gazing down as though judging Matthew, even now. Pushing open the heavy oak door, Matthew entered the hushed chamber. The bench rose before him like an altar, its polished wood gleaming under the soft light. The public gallery was half full, people murmuring in anxious whispers. Opposing counsel Julia Barnes, her red hair pulled into a tight knot, rose as he took his place. Her dark suit clung to her like armor. "Your Honor," she began, voice steady. "Before we proceed, I move to recuse the bench." She laid a fresh file on the lectern, her eyes never leaving Matthew's. "We have reason to believe this court may be compromised." Matthew's chest tightened. "On what grounds, Miss Barnes?" His voice carried easily through the silent room. Barnes paused, opening the file. "An anonymous tip alleges improper conduct in a prior ruling, specifically that Your Honor accepted gifts from the opposing party in case 207. She let the words hang, watching as a ripple of shock passed through the courtroom. A cold flush swept over Matthew. He swallowed. "This is baseless," he said, voice low. "I have accepted no gifts." He glanced toward the gallery, faces blurred, surprised. Before he could continue, a tall figure in plain clothes rose from the back, Lieutenant Lucas Marlowe, known for his fierce loyalty to the force. Marlowe's uniform shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, his tie hung loose, and his eyes glittered with purpose. He moved to the front, producing a sealed envelope. "Stand aside, counsel," he said, voice as hard as steel. Barnes looked momentarily taken aback. Even she seemed to sense the shift in power. Matthew furrowed his brow. "Lieutenant Marlowe, what is the meaning of this intrusion?" he asked. Marlowe ignored the question. He broke the seal on the envelope and withdrew a warrant, sliding it across the bench. Matthew leaned forward. The court reporter stilled her pen. The warrant bore the seal of the state and charged tampering with judicial records and obstruction of justice. Matthew felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath him. "This court is hereby ordered to detain Matthew Sullivan, judge of the 3rd District, pending investigation," Marlowe announced, voice cold and final. Gasps echoed through the room. Matthew rose slowly, robe rustling like fallen leaves. "Arrest me? In my own courtroom." His words trembled, but his eyes searched Marlowe's for any flicker of decency. Marlowe produced handcuffs, their metal glinting under the lights. He slipped them around Matthew's wrists with clinical precision. The click reverberated through the chamber like a gavel strike. Matthew's breath caught in his throat. A murmur of shock swept the gallery. "Objections?" Marlowe asked, looking at the bailiff. When none came, he gestured for Matthew to step down. As Matthew descended the bench, his robes dragging behind him, the assembled onlookers watched in stunned silence. He passed Barnes, whose lips were a thin line of triumph and unease. He caught her eye and saw, or thought he saw, a flash of something. Relief? Guilt? It vanished as quickly as it appeared. In the corridor, officers formed a gauntlet. Cameras from local news crews flashed, capturing every angle of his humiliation. Reporter Elena Carter thrust a microphone forward. "Judge Sullivan, can you comment on these allegations?" Her voice was urgent, demanding. Matthew lifted his head, eyes blazing with indignation. "I have nothing to hide," he said, voice echoing. "These charges are false. I will clear my name." But his words felt hollow in the hush that followed. Even his own conviction wavered in the face of such public disgrace. Lieutenant Marlowe steered him toward a patrol car parked curbside. A cold wind whipped rain into his face, each drop like an accusation. He tried to steady himself, to hold onto the dignity that had defined him. Yet the sight of his own hands in cuffs, the weight of the warrant in his pocket, felt like a betrayal more painful than any crime. Detective Daniel Cross arrived on the scene, uniform crisp, badge gleaming. He kept his distance at first, watching the exchange with narrowed eyes. When Marlowe hesitated at the car door, Cross stepped forward. "Lieutenant," Cross said, quietly, "we need to move him to Central Precinct. I'll handle it from there." Marlowe nodded curtly and released Matthew into Cross's custody. As Cross snapped the cuffs closed, Matthew saw something flicker in the detective's gaze. Regret? Doubt? He dared to meet Cross's eyes. "Daniel," he said, voice strained, "you know, I would never do this." Cross's jaw tightened. He said nothing, offering only a curt nod. The silence between them was suffocating. In that moment, Matthew felt the sting of betrayal sharpen, either by Marlowe's zeal or Cross's unwilling obedience. Inside the patrol car, Matthew was seated between two officers whose eyes avoided his. His robe was bunched around him, and the handcuffs dug into his wrists. The engine's growl was muffled by the roar of his thoughts. Who had orchestrated this? Who wanted to see him broken? And why leverage a warrant so publicly? At the precinct, the interrogation room was windowless and fluorescent lit. Cross closed the door behind them, leaving Matthew alone with a file on the table. He picked it up with trembling fingers, photographs of documents, transcripts of conversations, evidence purportedly showing Matthew's involvement in altering records. But the paper felt foreign in his hand, the words made no sense. Cross finally returned, carrying a cup of lukewarm coffee. He set it before Matthew. "You need to calm down," he said softly. "We'll sort this out." Matthew stared at the cup as though it might hold the answers. He picked it up, surprised by the warmth. He drew a shaky breath and met Cross's eyes. "Someone set me up," he said, voice low. "I need your help to find out who." Cross's shoulders tensed. He looked at the file, then back at Matthew. "There's more to this than a simple frame-up," he said. "I've been digging. The letter you got, that warning, came from someone high up, someone with power." Matthew's heart pounded. "Then help me stop them." Cross leaned in. "I can't promise anything. They watch every move. But I'll do what I can." A distant rumble of thunder rolled through the building. Matthew realized how alone he felt, save for this reluctant ally. The walls seemed to close in, the fluorescent lights glaring. He pressed his palms to the table, knuckles whitening. Outside, rain hammered the roof like an urgent heartbeat. The interrogation room door swung open, and an officer led in Matthew's robe and collar, now marked as evidence. He watched as they placed them in an evidence bag, his symbols of authority reduced to sealed plastic. When the door closed again, Matthew sank into the chair, ordering his thoughts like a defense. The inciting event, the public arrest, had shattered his world. He felt raw, betrayed by a system he'd loved. But beneath the shock, a spark flickered. And in that vow, the true trial of Matthew Sullivan began. The cell, was small and chilly, the walls stained a dull gray, but to Matthew Sullivan it felt like a gilded cage compared to the courtroom he once commanded. Detective Daniel Cross hovered at the open door, his uniform crisp but his posture uneasy, as if guarding a truth he wasn't sure he wanted to share. Matthew sat on the narrow bench, robe bunched around his legs, hands cuffed to the metal bar. The dull scrape of shoes outside made him look up. Cross stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him. "Daniel," Matthew said, voice low. "Thank you for coming." Cross cleared his throat, leaning against the wall. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me after. Well, after everything." His eyes flickered toward the cuffs. Matthew eased his wrists. "I need allies, not judges." Cross ran a hand through his dark hair. "I know, and I'm here." He pulled a sealed manila envelope from his pocket and laid it on the bench between them. "I've been digging. I managed to hack into internal logs, only thanks to an old friend in cybercrime. Look at this." Matthew opened the envelope with gloved fingertips. Inside were printouts, time-stamped entries showing that an anonymous user, IP masked but traced back to a corporate network, had accessed the very same judicial database Matthew oversaw. Someone had fed false records into the system, then pointed them at him. The final entry, a scanned copy of the warrant, filed minutes before it appeared in courtroom 3. "My own court files," Matthew whispered, eyes scanning the pages. "They doctored them to frame me." Cross nodded. "And it goes deeper. The access logs match traffic from the law firm of Barnes and Drake." Matthew's heart jolted at the name. Julia Barnes, the prosecutor who had moved to recuse him. "Julia?" He looked up, unbelieving. Cross swallowed. "She's their front. But I've heard rumors she's conflicted. She said she admired you before this case. She's under pressure, but not heartless." Matthew pressed his palms to the bench, steadying himself. "We need to know her part." Cross hesitated. "I can't confront her directly, not yet. But I've got someone on the inside who might turn." They lapsed into silence, the weight of hidden loyalties pressing in. Outside, footsteps receded. The precinct seemed oblivious to their quiet conspiracy. In that stillness, Matthew felt both hope and dread. He stood and braced himself against the wall. "What's next?" Cross met his gaze. "I'll plant a tracker on her car, just enough to follow her movements. If she meets with Ethan Drake, we'll know." Matthew nodded, resolving hardening. "Do it, but be careful." Julia Barnes paced her spacious office, the glow of a single desk lamp casting long shadows on stacks of case files. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window, staring out at empty streets slick with rain. Her red hair, usually pinned into severe perfection, had loosened with the tension of the morning. She fingered a crumpled note in her hand. "Protect the powerful." It felt like a noose around her neck. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. "Ethan." Taking a breath, she answered, "Mr. Drake." A smooth male voice crackled through the speaker. "Julia, you followed through?" "Yes." She paced back to her desk and sank into the leather chair. The motion to recuse was filed. He looked surprised. He's wounded his reputation, his dignity. Drake's laugh was thin. "Good. Keep him off balance. The hearing next week must proceed without his influence." His tone dipped. "But I want him handled discreetly. The public spectacle is counterproductive." Julia closed her eyes. "Understood. But I admired him once. His kindness, his integrity." Drake paused, then spoke softly. "Personal feelings don't enter the courtroom. Remember that." The line went dead before Julia could reply. She clenched the phone, anger and guilt twisting inside her. She rose and moved to her desk, rifling through papers until she found a photograph of Matthew, taken at a charity gala months ago. He was smiling at Sophie, handing her a ribbon. Julia's eyes blurred. She whispered, "I'm sorry." Tucking the photo into her coat pocket, she reached for her car keys. Outside, thunder rumbled, and she braced herself for what she must do next. Lieutenant Lucas Marlowe sat in his precinct office, reviewing files under harsh fluorescent light. He was a man defined by duty. Dark hair cropped close, posture rigid, every line of his uniform immaculate. He tapped a pen against the desk as he studied Matthew's personnel record. The more he learned, the more convinced he became that the judge was guilty. Yet a stubborn itch at the back of his mind whispered otherwise. His phone vibrated. He glanced down to see an unknown number. He answered. "Marlowe." A distorted voice replied, "The judge will deliver his own sentence soon enough. Until then, maintain public order." Marlowe's jaw clenched. "Yes, sir. But what about Cross? He's too close to Sullivan." "Cross is loyal to the badge. He will not betray the department." The voice sounded amused. "Trust the process." Marlowe closed his eyes and breathed out. He was caught between orders and conscience, between the man he believed in and the machine that demanded obedience. He returned to his files, but every name, every date, seemed tainted by someone else's hand. Outside, rain lashed against the windows. He tapped the desk again. "Maintain public order," he muttered, as though testing the words against his own resolve. At the Sullivan home, Emily Sullivan sat by the living room window, Sophie curled beside her with a sketchbook. The house was stilled by worry. The television played a loop of news reports. Judge arrested in shocking turn. Courtroom chaos unfolds. Sophie drew rainbow arches over a stick-figure family. Emily's eyes, red-rimmed from tears, stayed fixed on her daughter's hands. "Sophie," she said gently, "do you want to go over your spelling words?" The little girl looked up, brow furrowed. "Is Daddy coming home soon, Mama?" Emily swallowed. "I don't know, honey." She touched Sophie's cheek. "Your daddy's in trouble. But he's strong and he'll find a way." Sophie shrugged and went back to drawing. Emily watched her, torn between comfort and despair. She pushed herself up, pacing the room. Memories of Matthew's kindness flooded her. The way he tucked Sophie in at night, the hush in his voice when he promised her dreams. Now he was behind bars, fighting for truth against shadows she could scarcely name. She sank onto the couch, phone trembling in her hand. She dialed Daniel Cross's number. It rang twice before he answered. "Detective Cross? This is Emily Sullivan." "Mrs. Sullivan," Cross said, cautious but warm. "How can I help?" She hesitated, emotion choking her. "Daniel, I know you're working to clear Matthew. Please, anything you learn, tell me." He hesitated. "I will. I'm doing everything I can." "Thank you," she whispered. She ended the call and held Sophie close, praying that the light in her husband's eyes would return soon. Back at headquarters, Matthew and Cross devised a plan. The detective had secured an old pager and a burner phone. They would use coded messages to summon Julia if she chose to help. Matthew studied a crude floor plan of Barnes and Drake's offices, tracing corridors and exits. He ran a finger along the dotted lines. "We'll need to place the tracker on her car tonight." Cross nodded. "I can't do that inside the precinct, but I can slip out on foot during shift change. She'll park right where I can reach." Matthew exhaled. "Good. Then we wait." Cross leaned forward, voice low. "I want you to know, I'm sorry I followed orders so blindly. I believe the evidence. But seeing you break, I realized how easy it is to destroy someone's life." Matthew met his eyes. "We all have our duties, Daniel. What matters is choosing them wisely." He looked away, toward the window where the rain had eased to a soft drizzle. "Thank you, my friend." Outside, a car alarm sounded, a distant reminder that the city, like their lives, was never truly still. In the soft hum of rain, Matthew's resolve shone through the darkness. The drama unfolding around him was no longer a spectacle. It was his life, his family, his future. Relationships strained by secrets would unravel, loyalties would shift, and buried motives would claw their way into the open. But for now, in the fragile quiet of the precinct, Matthew Sullivan and Daniel Cross prepared to strike back at the conspirators who had tried to bury the truth. And as the night settled in, they knew the real test. Their rising action had only just begun. Matthew hardly slept that night. The precinct's overhead lights burned in his mind long after he left the interrogation room. When his pager vibrated just past midnight, he knew Matthew's robe bore the dust of the day's trial. but he pulled it tighter against his shoulders as he hurried down empty streets. Street lamps cast long shadows that twisted and writhed like dark fingers. Each step echoed, his leather shoes clicking against cracked pavement. Rain threatened again, and he saw clouds roiling above the harbor. At the end of a narrow lane, the pier jutted into black water. Wooden pilings creaked in the tide, and the boards beneath his feet were slick with algae. He heard a whisper of movement. Daniel! Cross emerged from behind a stack of rusted shipping containers. His face was pale, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. He held something in his hand, Julia's key fob. "I got it," he said. His voice trembled. Matthew stepped forward. "Good work. Where is she now?" Cross swallowed. "That's not exactly why I wanted to meet." He drew in a shaky breath. "Look at this." He flicked on his phone, handing it to Matthew. A single message glowed on the cracked screen. Phase 1, secure Sullivan. Phase 2, finalize removal. Ed. Matthew started. ED Ethan Drake. Cross stared back. "Ethan sent me that." Matthew's heart thudded. He handed the phone back. "You met with him?" Cross ran a hand through his hair, rain beginning to mist down between them. "I didn't have a choice. He has my sister." His voice broke. "He threatened her life if I didn't help." For a moment, Matthew saw the detective he had trusted, the man who had looked him in the eye and promised loyalty. But now Cross stood before him, the join between duty and betrayal torn open. "You set me up," Matthew whispered. Cross bowed his head, rain dripping from his chin. "I didn't want to. I tried to find another way. But when Barnes recused, nothing else mattered. They picked you off first, and then they used me." Matthew's knees felt weak. He leaned against a piling, desperate to steady himself. "You gave them the warrant. You told Marlowe to arrest me." Cross nodded, eyes hollow. "I did. I'm sorry. But every time I thought to back out, I'd get word she was at risk. Julia, she thinks she's helping me. I thought if I kept her close, I could protect both of you." "I could," his voice choked. Matthew looked at the dark water, moonlight trembling on the surface. Betrayal was a blade spun in every direction. "Julia was only a pawn," he asked, voice rough. "She didn't know the worst," Cross said. "I planted the doubt about you, but she believed her orders were from higher up in the firm." He closed his eyes as if to seal away the memory. "I carried the letter to you, my handwriting disguised, so you'd be unnerved. It had to look anonymous. I had to keep you off guard." Matthew closed his eyes against the hurt. "You watched me dragged from my bench," he said, voice distant. "You watched me cuffed." Cross swallowed. "I couldn't do anything. I called off the finalists at the precinct. I kept you alive in the cell, but you didn't know." He reached out, voice pleading. "Please believe me. I still want to help you." Matthew turned away from him. Rain spattered his shoulders, felt like icy tears. "I don't know what to believe anymore," he said, the words bitter. "You betrayed me, lied to me. You ruined my life." A sudden splash at the water's edge made them both whip around. A figure stumbled from behind the containers, Julia Barnes, pale and soaked, coat clutched tight. She froze when she saw Daniel holding Matthew's phone. "Daniel," she called, voice trembling. Matthew tucked the phone away, feeling its heat against his chest. "Julia," he said softly. She watched him, confusion turning into hurt. Cross stepped between them. "Julia, it's not what it looks like." His eyes pleaded, but Julia's gaze flicked with something else. Anger, betrayal, disbelief. "I came here because I realized something was off," she said, voice trembling. She looked first at Cross, then at Matthew. "This phone, I saw that message too." She drew in a breath. "You told me you had a lead on the corporate network hack. You said you were feeding me information to help clear Matthew. But your logs never matched up." Cross shook his head. "I was trying to protect you. They said they'd go after your career, destroy you if I backed out." Julia's eyes filled with tears. "I would have taken that risk. I would have stood by you." Matthew watched her, heart torn. The woman he had once seen as an adversary now looked lost and vulnerable. "Julia," he said, voice gentle, "thank you for coming." She met his eyes. "Are you okay?" Matthew felt the edge of the world tilt. He closed his eyes, letting the rain wash over his face. "I will be," he said, finally, but not tonight. Julia nodded, turning to Cross. Daniel, why didn't you tell me? Cross's shoulders slumped. I feared for you. His voice cracked. Forgive me. Julia shook her head. I don't know if I can. She took a step back. I need time. Matthew laid a hand on Cross's arm. Go, he said quietly. Both of you. Go somewhere safe. Cross hesitated, gaze flicking between them. Then he slipped into the night, shoulders hunched against the rain. Julia followed, her red hair slick against her face, hesitation and conflict in every step. Left alone on the pier, Matthew pressed his fist to his chest over the hidden phone. The betrayal cut deeper than any false charge. He felt raw, exposed. The rain fell harder now, drumming a wild tattoo on the wooden planks. Somewhere far off, a ship's horn bellowed into the darkness. He sank to one knee, the plume of his robe spreading on the wetboards. Memories of earlier days flooded him. Daniel's promise over a cup of coffee, Julia's firm handshake after a court session, the quiet pride he'd felt when Sophie drew his picture as best daddy judge. All of it shattered, but beneath the ache, a spark ignited. If Cross had been forced, if Julia had been kept in the dark, then the real villain lay elsewhere, Ethan Drake, and the unseen hands pulling his strings. And if Cross's sister was in danger, if Julia risked her career for him, then he could not let this end in blood or broken lives. He stood, the boards creaking under his weight. He reached for his robe, then tore at the inner pocket. The folded letter he'd received weeks ago fell to the floor. Some truths are buried to protect the powerful. Your silence will see them remain so. He read it again, the black ink soaked through by rain. He folded it, tucked it into his breast pocket. The letter had warned him of power's deadly reach, and now he had looked into the face of that power's cruelty and feeble mercy alike. Matthew took a step toward the water's edge, wind tugging at his robes. In the distance, lights gleamed on the far shore, ships, cranes, the restless city. Each shimmer was a reminder that life carried on, indifferent to betrayal or pain. He drew in a deep breath, the salt tang of the sea filling his lungs. He would not collapse under this weight. He would stand and fight, not for revenge, but to save the innocent caught in the storm, Cross's sister, Julia's career, Emily and Sophie's peace, and his own shattered reputation. As the storm broke overhead, rain pouring in a single silver sheet, Matthew Sullivan lifted his head and whispered into the howling wind, I will find the truth. And in that vow, the first twist of his journey, his own ally's betrayal, became the crucible in which his resolve was forged anew. Matthew moved through the front door of his home as the sky above him cracked open with another downpour. He closed the door gently, his shoulders hunched under the weight of betrayal and rain. Inside, the lamp on the side table cast a warm glow across the hallway, softening the edges of worry on Emily's face as she looked up from where she'd been waiting. Sophie's drawing lay half-finished on the coffee table, colored rainbows spilling off the page onto the worn wood. Matthew, Emily said, voice trembling with relief and fear. She stepped toward him, her arms open. He allowed himself a moment to be held, to feel the solid truth of her heartbeat against his chest. But as her hands closed on his arms, her eyes flicked past him toward the window. He turned, alert. Shadows danced in the narrow yard, branches bent low in the wind. A single figure stood beyond the glass, watching. Matthew's breath caught. The silhouette, broad shoulders, stance defiant, was too familiar. Lucas, he whispered. Emily's grip tightened. It's not Lucas Marlowe, she said, voice trembling. That man, she swallowed. He was on my porch 10 minutes ago. Matthew's hand dropped from Emily's arm, and he hurried to the window. The rain blurred his view, but he saw only the outline of someone slipping away into the night. His heart pounded. Whoever it was had vanished before he could call out. In the uneasy silence, his phone buzzed. Matthew yanked it from his pocket. A text from Daniel Cross, safe house compromised. Sarah is gone. His chest sank. Sarah was Cross's sister, the very person whose life had kept Daniel bound to Ethan's evil designs. Emily's lips parted. but no sound came. Sophie appeared behind her mother, wide-eyed in her pajamas. Matthew knelt to scoop his daughter into his arms. She clung to him, whispering, "Daddy, what's wrong?" He kissed her hair, heart-splitting. "Nothing's wrong, sweetheart," he lied, "just a bad dream." But even as he spoke, he knew it was more than that. He stood and turned to Emily. "We need to help Daniel," he said, voice tight. He pointed to the phone screen. "They've taken his sister." Emily's face went pale. "His sister," she echoed. "But why?" "Because they still control Daniel," Matthew answered. "They'll use Sarah to force him further. We have to find her before it's too late." Emily swallowed and nodded. "What can I do?" Matthew glanced at the drawing on the table, Sophie's bright arches and smiling figures. "Keep Sophie here," he said softly. "Stay inside. Lock every door. I'll handle this." She reached for his hand. "I'm coming with you." He shook his head firmly. "No, you have Sophie. If anything happens, I can't lose you both." He kissed her forehead, then hurried to the front hall where his robe lay. He tugged it on, then paused, eyes dark with worry. "Be safe," he whispered. Emily closed her arms around him. For a moment, he let himself lean into her, savoring the warmth. Then he straightened abruptly and was gone. The rain slammed against his robe as he ran toward the precinct. Lights flickered along the street, and traffic lights glowed like warning beacons. He crossed by the old library and ducked into an alley to catch his breath. His lungs burned, but he welcomed the pain. It grounded him, reminded him he was alive. He slipped in through the back entrance of the station, nodding to a surprised night clerk. Inside, the front desk was empty, phones ringing unanswered. He dashed up the stairs to Daniel's old office, the door ajar. Papers lay scattered on the floor, drawers yanked open, evidence reports strewn like autumn leaves. He crouched to pick up the file marked Sarah Cross, location safe house. It was torn, wet at the edges. His pulse quickened. Whoever had come here had been searching for that. He backed away just as Daniel emerged from the interrogation room, face drawn. "Matthew," he said, voice low, "what are you doing here?" "No time," Matthew said, voice urgent. "Sarah's missing. The safe house was compromised." Daniel's face went ashen. "How?" "Someone came here," Matthew interrupted. "They knew about this room." Daniel pressed a hand to the doorframe. "I thought it was secure." He ran a hand over his short hair. "They must have had a mole." Matthew's mind scrambled. "Then we need to find Sarah ourselves." Daniel shook his head. "Matthew, if they catch us together." He swallowed and steadied himself. "We have to try." Daniel hesitated, then nodded. "I have one lead." He reached into his coat and produced a crumpled slip of paper. A name, Maria Solano. She's a courier who worked for Ethan Drake. I paid her off once, but she's lying low now. If anyone knows where he keeps hostages. Matthew took the paper. "Where can I find her?" Daniel's eyes darkened. "East Side Docks, Warehouse 12. He looked down the corridor. "We need move." They slipped out together, careful to avoid cameras and patrols. Outside, Matthew felt the rain cool on his face as though it were a baptism before battle. At the docks, the warehouse loomed like a silent judge, its windows boarded, doors padlocked. A flicker of light shone from a side window, Maria's signal. Matthew tapped on the metal siding. A voice hissed, "Who is it?" "Matthew Sullivan," he called. "I need Maria Solano." The board covering the window creaked open. Maria's eyes, sharp where he peered out. She studied him, then nodded and slipped out. Daniel moved to stand guard while Maria guided Matthew around the back to a broken window. She slipped inside and guided him through dusty crates and tangled ropes until they reached a small office lit by a single lamp. Maria closed the door behind them. "Be quick," she whispered. "They watch this place." Matthew leaned forward. "Where is she?" Maria hesitated. "The last I heard, one of Drake's men, Greco, took her to an old mill north of town. It's abandoned now, but they've fortified it. They want to break her spirit before sending evidence to whoever orchestrated this." Matthew's heart clenched. He closed his eyes. Sarah, a young woman with her whole life ahead, trapped because of his case. His chest ached with responsibility. "Thank you," he said softly. "Please stay here if they come looking." Maria nodded, fading into shadow. Matthew slipped back through the broken window and moved to where Daniel waited. The detective's face was tight. "We go in quietly," Daniel said. "No, gunfire, too many cameras." Matthew nodded. "I'll distract them." They crossed the wet pavement toward the mill. The building rose like a fallen cathedral, broken windows crowning its ruined facade. They crept along its side until they found a service door, unlocked. Inside, the scent of old flour and grease clung to the air. Ferguson lights flickered overhead as they slipped into a corridor lined with metal lockers. Voices echoed ahead. Matthew strained to listen. Two guards talking quietly, their rifles slung across their backs. Daniel held up his hand. "On three." They darted out. Daniel knocked one guard unconscious with the butt of his gun, and Matthew lunged at the other, slamming him into a crate. They bound the men quickly with rope torn from a nearby coil. Before they could move on, a harsh voice called from above, "Hey, what's going on?" Matthew's heart raced. He motioned to Daniel. They scampered down a side hallway, following Maria's directions until they reached a locked door marked storage. Inside, a single bulb swung overhead. And then Matthew saw her, Sarah Cross, seated on a metal chair, wrists shackled to the back. She looked up, eyes wide with hope and fear. "Judge Sullivan," she whispered. He rushed forward, releasing her bonds with trembling hands. "Sarah, you're safe now." She wrapped her arms around him, trembling. "I was so scared." He held her close, voice soft. "You're safe now." Then he looked at Daniel. "We need to get her out." Daniel kept watch as Matthew helped Sarah to her feet. Maria appeared behind them, glancing at the guards still unconscious on the floor. "I'll cover our tracks," she murmured, disappearing into the darkness. Together, they retraced their steps, slipping out through the service door and into the rain-slicked night. Matthew guided Sarah and Maria toward the waiting car that Daniel had parked half a block away. Hands shook as they climbed in. Once inside, the three huddled together, shoulders wet with rain. Daniel sank into the driver's seat, glancing at Sarah in the rearview mirror. Her face was pale, but alive with gratitude. Matthew laid a gentle hand on her arm. "You're safe now," he repeated, voice steadying. He looked at Daniel. "We'll take her somewhere no one can find her." Daniel's eyes glowed with relief. "Safe house number 2, under my sister's name. It's secure." Matthew exhaled. "Thank you, Daniel." Outside, thunder rumbled, but inside the car, for a moment, there was only quiet triumph. Yet he knew this victory carried a cost. His daughter shivered under Emily's protection, unsure of why Daddy had left in the storm. Julia Barnes's silence still weighed on his conscience, and Ethan Drake's shadow stretched across every corner of his life. He closed his eyes and whispered into the cramped space, "I will protect them all." The car pulled away into the night, headlights cutting through rain, bearing 4 souls into the rising tide of danger and into a test of his most difficult choice yet. Rain pounded against the shattered windows of the old textile mill as Matthew Sullivan pressed himself into the shadow of a rusted support beam. The cavernous space yawned before him, rows of broken looms standing like silent sentinels, water dripping from overhead pipes in a drumming symphony. Flaring torches set by Drake's men cast flickering shadows across corrugated walls, turning every surface into a roiling sea of light and dark. Matthew's heart thundered in his chest as he surveyed the scene. Ahead, a makeshift dais of wooden pallets held Ethan Drake's polished desk, papers strewn across it, contracts, forged judicial orders, proof of the conspiracy to usurp Matthew's bench. Ethan stood behind the desk, tall and broad-shouldered in a tailored suit that glistened with rain, his dark hair slicked back. At his side, Julia Barnes was held by 2 guards, tears tracking through mud on her cheeks. Daniel Cross knelt beside her, one arm around her shoulders, the other hand clenched in a fist. "Judge Sullivan, I wondered when you'd show up." He tapped a finger on a stack of papers. "I suggest you drop the theatrics and join me." Matthew's gaze swept the battleground, guards with rifles trained on him, Julia trembling but alive, Daniel struggling with his own guilt. He swallowed the fear and climbed the few steps to the desk. The glare of torchlight danced in his eyes as he met Drake's. "You force my hand." Drake laughed low and harsh. "Your hand or your weakness. You let yourself be framed, cuffed in your own courtroom. You let your family, your daughter, fear for your life." He gestured to Julia. "And you let my enemies use your allies to manipulate you." Matthew's fists tightened. "Your enemies? You mean me. I'm not your enemy." He reached into his robe and produced the forged warrant. "These are lies you planted in the records. You threatened Daniel with his sister's life, used Julia's ambition against her, and even tapped my own court system." He held the paper out. "You thought you could destroy me, bury the truth beneath your money?" Drake's smile flickered. He leaned forward. "You misunderstand, Judge. I don't want to destroy you. I want to replace you. You're weak. Emotion drives you. Seeing yourself in defendants, letting sentiment cloud your judgments. I intend to install someone stronger, one who follows the law without mercy or doubt." Matthew's pulse stuttered. The law! He swallowed the bitter truth that Drake's twisted vision was what had nearly broken him. The law is justice. It isn't cruelty. It isn't power. Drake straightened, voice cold. "Which is precisely why you interfere." He nodded to the guards. "Take him." Two large men stepped forward. Matthew's breath caught, but then Julia's voice rang out, sharp with defiance. "Stop!" Drake's brow arched. "Julia." She twisted free of the guard's grip, stepping onto the dais. Her red hair clung to her face, but her eyes blazed with resolve. "I refuse." She drew in a ragged breath. "I've followed orders, too many lies. But I can't watch you crush him." Drake's lips curled with contempt. "You're fired, Barnes." Julia's voice did not waver. "I quit." She pointed at Drake's desk, knocking papers to the floor. "You weaponized every life you touched, my career, Daniel's sister, Matt's family. You think you're above the law, but you're a coward." She turned to Matthew. "I'm sorry I helped." Matthew felt a swell of emotion as Julia joined him. "Thank you." He laid a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Then he faced Drake again. "Your plans end tonight." Drake laughed, a hollow sound. Bold words. He lifted a pistol from his desk, sleek, black. He aimed at Matthew's chest, but words don't stop power. The guard nearest Daniel cursed and lunged for Drake. Before he could reach him, Drake fired. The crack of the shot echoed like a judge's gavel. The guard collapsed, blood blooming across his chest. Daniel cried out, dropping to his knees. Sarah screamed. Julia gasped, stumbling back. Matthew's heart froze. Every instinct roared at him. Protect Julia, shield Daniel, save Sarah. He darted forward, grabbing the fallen guard's rifle. He leveled it at Drake, voice low and steady. "Put down the gun." Drake's eyes were cold steel. "Do it." Matthew's finger trembled on the trigger. He could see the faint light reflecting off Drake's polished shoes, the faint drip of water from his suit. He willed himself calm. "This ends now. Put the gun down. Surrender." Drake's chest heaved. For a heartbeat, the world paused, the rain, the torchlight, the puddles rippling around their feet. Then Drake let the pistol clatter to the floor. A guard seized it, pressing it into his belt. Drake raised his hands. "You win." Behind Matthew, Julia, and Daniel shifted to help the wounded guard, their faces pale with shock and relief. Sarah clung to Julia, small and shaking. Emily Sullivan and Lucas Marlowe burst through the open doors. Police backup, floodlights blazing across the mill floor. Lieutenant Marlowe barked orders. Officers flooded in, securing Drake's men, cuffing them to rusted railings. He strode to Drake, snapping on handcuffs. "Ethan Drake, you're under arrest for kidnapping, attempted murder, tampering with judicial records, and conspiracy to subvert justice." Drake's shoulders slumped, eyes dark with defeat. Matthew approached, the rifle lowered but still in his grip. Marlowe eyed him coolly. Matthew handed the weapon back to an officer. "It's over," he said quietly. Marlowe nodded, respect in his eyes. You did good, Judge. Matthew set his jaw. He looked at Drake one last time. Justice is not a tool of the powerful. It's a shield for the innocent. Then he turned away. Outside, the rain had slowed to a gentle pattern. Emily wrapped Matthew in a tight embrace as Sophie ran into his arms. Daddy, she cried. Matthew held his daughter close, smelling the lavender shampoo in her hair. I'm here, sweetheart. He kissed her head, then let his eyes meet Emily's, tired, hopeful, proud. He exhaled, feeling the tension drain from his shoulders. Daniel knelt beside Sarah, brushing rain from her hair. You're safe, he told her. I promise. Julia stood nearby, hand on Daniel's arm watching. Matthew approached them, voice warm. How are you both? Sarah managed a small smile. I'm scared, but I'm okay. She looked at Daniel. Thank you. Daniel squeezed her hand. Thank you, for bravery I didn't deserve. He met Matthew's eyes. Judge, I'm sorry. Matthew placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. You're my friend. We'll rebuild together. Julia stepped forward, speaking softly. Matthew, there's more. I have evidence, emails, internal memos that tied Drake's bosses in high places. I want to give them to you. He nodded. We'll bring them to the state attorney. He reached into his robe and unfolded the papers Drake had left behind, the final proof of the conspiracy. And with these, we'll expose anyone involved. Behind them, officers loaded Drake and his men into patrol cars. Lights flashed blue and red, illuminating the battered mill in stark relief. The rain eased, revealing pale dawn light on the horizon. Matthew Sullivan stepped onto the platform of pallets, one last time, the boards creaking under his feet. He looked across the scene, Emily and Sophie safe, Daniel and Sarah reunited, Julia standing with new purpose. He drew in a deep breath of cold morning air. In that moment, he understood that justice was not a solitary gavel strike, but the courage to stand for truth even when surrounded by darkness. He turned to Lieutenant Marlowe. Thank you for trusting me. Marlowe gave a small nod. It was your strength that made me believe. Matthew climbed down, joining his family and friends. Together, they walked toward the waiting cars, toward safety and a new beginning. Weeks later, back in courtroom 3, Matthew Sullivan donned his robe once more. The gallery was packed. Reporters, community leaders, even Emily and Sophie watching from the back. Julia sat at the prosecutor's table, her posture straight, determination in her eyes. Daniel watched from a seat beyond the bench, still in uniform, honored to be there. The judge called the court to order. Matthew lifted his gaze to the assembled crowd. We are here not simply to punish wrongdoing, he began, voice steady and resonant, but to affirm the principles that bind our society, fairness, integrity, and the rule of law. He paused, allowing the words to settle. Let this case stand as a reminder that no man, however powerful, can stand above justice, and that even in our darkest hours, truth will endure. Julia rose, presenting the evidence against Drake's accomplices in government and business, her voice clear and unwavering. Matthew listened, pride warming him as he heard her passion for justice restored. When the final verdict was read, guilty on all counts, Matthew felt the gavel's echo resonate not just through the chambers, but in his own heart. Outside, Sophie skipped ahead of Emily, holding a small bouquet of daisies she had picked from the courthouse lawn. Matthew knelt to receive them. For you, Sophie said, handing him the flowers. He smelled their fresh sweetness, a symbol of hope. He kissed her forehead. Thank you, sweetheart. Emily slipped her hand into his. We're home, she whispered. Matthew looked up at the grand courtroom ceiling, where light streamed through stained glass. He closed his eyes. The storm had passed. The seat of justice stood firm once more, and so did he. In that quiet triumph, Matthew Sullivan understood that true justice was a journey, one that required sacrifice, courage, and unwavering faith in the light that follows the storm. And as the bailiff called the court to order, Matthew inhaled and felt a calm settle over him. The long fight was nearly over. The final hearings would disband Drake's network, the forged documents would be struck from the public record, and everyone responsible would answer for their crimes. He lifted his gaze to the assembled faces, some familiar friends, some who had once doubted him, and felt gratitude bloom in his chest. When Julia stood to present the state's closing argument, her voice rang clear. She spoke of justice restored, of the sanctity of the law, and of the courage required to stand against corruption. She did not shy away from acknowledging her own missteps, the times she'd blindly followed orders, the moments she'd let ambition eclipse conscience. But she had redeemed herself through truth-telling, and Matthew found himself moved by her honesty. After her speech, Matthew cleared his throat. "The law is not a blunt instrument," he said, voice steady. "It is a living promise we make to one another that our rights will be defended, our voices heard, our lives respected. When that promise is broken, we become less than ourselves." He paused, glancing at Drake's empty chair, a stark reminder that power must never eclipse principle. Let this case remind us that justice depends not on wealth or influence, but on integrity and courage. The judge on the state appellate bench nodded, then banged the gavel. "Guilty on all counts," he declared, sentencing to follow. A soft murmur of relief rippled through the courtroom. Emily exhaled, brushing a strand of hair from Sophie's face. Sophie beamed and whispered, "You did it, Daddy." Matthew met his daughter's gaze and smiled, a smile free of fear or doubt. He rose, lifting the robe's heavy folds, and descended the bench to embrace his family. Emily closed her eyes against his shoulder as he whispered, "It's over." Outside, reporters swarmed for comments, but Matthew stepped onto the courthouse steps and looked up at the towering pillars instead. He remembered the first day he'd walked through those doors as a hopeful young judge, believing in the simple clarity of right and wrong. He thought of the sleepless nights in custody, the betrayal by a friend he'd trusted, the terror in Sarah's eyes when she'd been taken for ransom. And yet here he stood, a stronger man, tempered by hardship, guided by compassion. That evening, back at the Sullivan home, calm had fully returned. Sophie lay asleep in her bed, her favorite stuffed bear tucked under one arm. Emily stood by the window, watching fireflies drift above the garden. Matthew leaned against the doorframe, robe discarded for a soft cardigan, and watched his wife's tranquil profile. Emily turned and smiled when she saw him. "You should rest," she said softly. "You've earned it." Matthew crossed the room and joined her at the window, the air carrying the scent of jasmine and rain-soaked earth. "I keep replaying everything," he admitted. "The moment I read that anonymous letter, the day I sat handcuffed in that interrogation room, the darkness I felt watching Daniel handcuff me, every step tested me." Emily slipped her hand into his. "You came through," she said. "You found the truth." He nodded, staring at the fireflies. "But I wonder, how do we guard ourselves against future shadows? How do we keep justice alive, rather than let it become another tool?" Her gaze softened. By remembering what matters, people trust mercy. By never forgetting that a gavel doesn't fix hearts, truth and compassion do. Matthew closed his eyes and leaned into her words. In the hush, he felt both the fragility and the resilience of his path. He recalled standing on that storm-lashed pier, vows spilling from his lips into the wind. He remembered discovering Julia's torn photograph, the way her eyes had filled with tears at the mill when she refused to deliver him up, like a broken toy. He saw Sarah's frightened face and Daniel's unspoken regret. All of it had brought him here to this moment of peace. He opened his eyes. "I want to be a judge who listens more than he speaks," he said. "Who sees people, not just cases." Emily leaned her head on his shoulder. "You already are." That night, Matthew sat alone on the front porch, the sky dark except for a single, brilliant star. He rubbed his hands together against the cool air, feeling memory and hope intertwine. He thought of the two twists that had upended his life. First, the collusion that put him in cuffs, then the betrayal by Daniel that plunged him deeper. Yet those shocks had also illuminated the path. revealing allies in unexpected places and exposing the rot that needed cutting away. He thought of Ethan Drake's hubris, of how someone could believe that cold ambition made him fit for power. He shuddered at the thought of how easily a person in authority can be corrupted, and resolved that his own authority would serve the powerless. A soft creak behind him made him turn, and he found Julia Barnes standing at the bottom step, her red hair loose in the night breeze. She held a small envelope. "I found this in the prosecutor's office," she said, handing it to him. Matthew took it, surprised by the seal. Inside was a single sheet of original stationery, the very paper of the note that had first warned him. Julia said, "I traced the handwriting to someone in Drake's inner circle, a Mr. Harrison. He supplied his crimes in exchange for favors. I imagine he'll confess now that you've secured the evidence." Matthew slowed to read her description of Harrison's looming trial. "Thank you," he said quietly. He folded the letter and held it close. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." Julia shook her head. "You taught me that justice isn't a ladder for ambition. It's a responsibility." Their eyes met in the lamplight, and for a moment they simply stood there, two people shaped by trials, bound by the pursuit of truth. Julia stepped back, offering him a gentle nod before she disappeared into the night. Left in silence once more, Matthew sank onto the top step, the envelope tucked safely in his pocket. He gazed at that lone star, feeling its cold light warm his chest. He considered the moral weight of authority, the temptation to judge swiftly, the need to offer grace. He understood now that true justice requires both firmness and mercy, the courage to expose evil and the humility to admit our own frailties. When he finally rose and stepped back inside, dawn was breaking. Emily stirred on the couch, and Sophie stirred beside her, blinking up at him in sleepy wonder. He scooped his daughter into his arms, feeling the sweet promise of new beginnings. As he carried Sophie to bed, he whispered, "This world will always hold storms, but so long as there are people willing to stand for truth, there will be light." He tucked his daughter in, kissed Emily gently, and rested by her side as the first sunbeams filled the room. His journey had tested him in ways he could never have imagined, but in the end he had emerged not only vindicated but transformed, reminded that justice is a living thing born of courage, refined by compassion, and sustained by the quiet choices we make in the dark. And as he closed his eyes, he felt ready to face whatever path lay ahead, knowing that every choice, like every sunrise, carried its own promise of justice tempered by mercy. Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like it, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more meaningful stories. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.